Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him! For 2 millennia, Christians have shouted these words on Good Friday, as we did just moments ago. And whether we realize it or not, for 2 millennia, Christians have been blaming Jews for killing Jesus. So tonight, I want to name something that eats at my soul. Anti-Semitism, the hatred of Jews, is the founding sin of our religion. The Passion story from the Gospel of John names the Jews as culprits 22 times in the death of Jesus. The other 3 Gospels are a little less harsh. Mark blames the crowd, but in John, it's the Jews. The English version of John we used tonight at Trinity Cathedral, as you may have noticed, changed Jews to Judeans, softening the impact from the official translation of the New Revised Standard Bible upon which it is based. You'll also notice tonight there is a new prayer at the end, coming up shortly in our collects, a new prayer for the Jewish people. And some of the prayers have been modified, taking out some of its harsher language about those who resist the faith. These are good starts at shifting the narrative. And if you want to do a comparison with the older version, it's in a leaflet that you can take home tonight. Yet we must note that changing a few words does not lessen the anti-Semitic history underlying them. This founding sin of our religion is deeply embedded in our tradition, and I want us to face it squarely tonight. And let me suggest it is especially crucial for us to face this founding sin if we are to begin to understand the carnage in the land claimed as sacred by Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Let me also say at the outset, I do not presume to know how to bring peace and justice to the Holy Land. That is not what this sermon is about. Greater minds than mine, and with more experience in the Middle East than I possess, I have only been there once, are struggling to find a solution. But Good Friday is a day when we don't mince words. Good Friday is not meant to be easy or comforting. But Good Friday is a good day to confront the anti-Jewish rhetoric in the Gospel of John and all that has flowed from it. Putting this in context, John was written at a time of bitter conflict between early Christians and Jewish religious authorities who were not accepting them as a Jewish sect. And to be sure, the Gospel of John is beloved by many for its intense mystical focus on the inner life and its proclamations of salvation. And it is not my intention to take John away from anyone. But John's gospel also castigates Jews as from below and as children from the devil, and presents this passion story blaming the Jews for killing Jesus. So we must note that the writer of John was not present at the death of Jesus. John's gospel was composed probably 80 or 90 years after Jesus lived. The writer of John had not yet been born when Jesus was alive. We must also note that crucifixion was the favored method of execution by the Romans. It's the Romans who killed Jesus. To the Romans, Jesus was just another troublemaking Jew upsetting the public order and who needed to be just put away. But notice that John's gospel goes out of its way to let the Roman governor Pontius Pilate off the hook. He, in fact, was known as one of the cruelest, most vicious of Roman governors and was finally removed by the Romans. But tragically, the anti-Jewish rhetoric of John, the last of the Gospels to be written, has cast a long shadow across the centuries. I believe it is therefore essential for us as Christians to see how this history has eaten at our souls. Let's start by acknowledging that Jesus was in fact Jewish. To this day, there are strands of Christianity who deny that he was Jewish, and that in itself is anti-Semitic. Some of Jesus' followers called him rabbi, and he debated other rabbis about the meaning of the Hebrew law and prophets, Torah and Nevi'im. In the centuries after his death, the idea took hold in early Christianity that Jesus substituted his body for the animal sacrifices of the Jewish temple. And by so doing, Christians had supplanted Jews as the chosen people of God. This theory, known as supersessionism, won favor with such church giants as St. Ambrose in the 4th century. Denunciations of Jews from the pulpit followed. Burning synagogues with Jews inside them followed. When Islam arose in the 7th century, Muslims converted vast swaths of the Middle East to Islam in regions where the Eastern Orthodox Church had dominated. And so European Christian leaders added Muslims to the list of those they hated. And so much else followed. The Crusades of the Middle Ages massacring Jews and Muslims alike. The pogroms against Jews in Eastern Europe and Russia. The wars against Muslims in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. The Nazi Holocaust of the 20th century. And the anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that still infect us. A few nights ago, the Sacramento City Council considered a resolution authored by Mayor Darrell Steinberg calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, the return of Israeli hostages from Hamas, and the release of Palestinian prisoners held without charge by the Israelis. And not surprisingly, it sparked vehement opposition on every imaginable side. The hearing went on for hours. Opinions were passionate, comments personal and painful. Not everyone was polite. You may reasonably question why the city council took this up. Yet it did represent an opportunity in our democracy to talk about issues that matter beyond the confines of our community. And I am deeply, deeply grateful to our own Dean Matthew, who was among the very few Christian leaders who showed up and spoke at the city council. And Dean Matthew forthrightly told of how our baptismal covenant calls us to respect the dignity of every human being with no exceptions. Without Dean Matthew and a few others, it felt as though to me like the Christian community had checked out. But we don't get to check out. All of this hatred and violence breaks Jesus' heart. We aren't allowed to be innocent bystanders. We aren't allowed to check out. How then do we engage with this? Put another way, how do we repent of our founding sin? We can begin by holding our own opinions gently, tenderly. We can listen intently to the stories of pain on all sides and face squarely our history and how this history still shapes us, sometimes in ways we aren't aware. Last spring, Lori and I tried to do this just a little bit. We traveled in Hungary, Austria, Germany, and the Netherlands. We explored medieval cities and towns and their cathedrals. And we especially sought out the old Jewish quarters that had been obliterated in persecutions. In Bamberg, the Gothic cathedral has a relief sculpture depicting a blindfolded Jewish woman dropping the Ten Commandments to the ground. And below her is a demon gouging out the eyes of a Jew. Elsewhere in Germany, our local guides pointed out that wherever you find a chapel devoted to the Virgin Mary, wherever you find one of those chapels in every little town, it's built on top of a synagogue that was burned to the ground by the townspeople in the Middle Ages. Anti-Semitism in Christianity did not end in the so-called Enlightened Ages. Martin Luther, the great father of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, wrote a 60,000-word book titled On the Jews and Their Lies. He also preached that Muslims were the Antichrist and tools of the devil. It's not a big leap to see how the Nazis and the Holocaust grew from these seeds of hatred embedded throughout Europe and elsewhere. In Budapest, in December 1944, Hungarian militias rounded up 3,000 Jews and took them to an embankment on the Danube River, where they were told to take off their shoes. The Jews were shot, their bodies falling into the river. The militias then stole their shoes, wearing them or selling them on the black market. We walked along the Danube embankment where this happened and saw a memorial recently made with 60 iron shoes lined up in rows as if their owners had just taken them off before they were shot. In Vienna, we stood below a balcony where Hitler declared that Austria was annexed into the Third Reich. That balcony remains closed because it is a current-day shrine for current-day neo-Nazis. Everywhere we went, we looked for little brass plaques placed on the sidewalks in front of homes of Holocaust victims. Each plaque has the people's names who lived in that house, the dates of their arrest, the dates of their death, the dates when they died, and where they died. Auschwitz, places like that. School children do the research into each victim and raise the money for the plaques. It's an act of great collective atonement by the children of a nation. These plaques are called stolpersteins, or stumbling stones. The idea is we are to stumble over them and remember what happened. Something else we need to remember. Nazis were a potent political force in our own country, the United States, in the 1930s. Calling themselves the Bund, brown-shirted Nazis rallied at Madison Square Garden in 1939 under a banner of George Washington. And then 20,000 Nazis marched down Broadway in New York. As Nazi persecution intensified in Europe, our State Department resisted allowing entry into the United States for escaped Jews. Shiploads of refugees were sent back to Europe to suffer their fate. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. 6 million human lives extinguished because they were Jewish. 6 million, think of that number. The state of Israel grew from these ashes when survivors could not return to their homes. They settled in lands where Palestinians, Bedouins, Armenians, and others already lived. Like it or not, we are still living in the aftermath of all of this. Like it or not, we are still living in the consequences of all of this. So tonight, please circle back to the seeds of so much horror, our founding sin, blaming Jews for the death of Jesus. How we understand the death of Jesus matters. How we understand the meaning of Good Friday really does matter. By dying in the worst way imaginable that a human being can die, Jesus shows us that God dwells not just in the bright sunlight, but in the shadowy dungeons of life where people suffer. Jesus goes to the cross not to substitute himself for the Jewish sacrifices. Jesus goes to the cross not as a ransom to some sort of bloodthirsty God, but Jesus goes to the cross as the divine one, willing to suffer with us as a human being, feeling every pain we feel, living in every hell where we live. And Jesus goes to the cross pointing for us to a place of healing beyond the valley of the shadow of death. We live in this valley now. We live in such shadow times. Good Fridays bombard us every single day, and we are left to weep at the foot of the cross. We weep for the brokenhearted and the lonely, for the sick and the dying. We weep for those in hospitals and jails and battlefields. We weep for those on the borders of our country and those living in refugee camps, and those living on the streets of our city. We weep for all those persecuted at the hands of the powerful, for those imprisoned for speaking out. We weep for those killed for the color of their skin, their caste, their sexual orientation, for the way they look. And we weep for those who were killed and kidnapped in Israel on October 7th. And we weep for those who have been killed and wounded in Gaza in this terrible war. We weep for all those in harm's way in Ukraine, Russia, Haiti, and all the troubled lands of this earth. Tonight, Good Friday, is for weeping. Tomorrow is for healing.